Yes, ma'am, you can start now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of High Glance Laboratories, pioneers of MDT formulation as brand Calculate for calcium deficiency, nanostructured rosuvastatin and telmisartan for better bioavailability as brand Yogaros and Yogatel respectively, a proven quality of tamsulosin and dutasteroid by bioequivalence study as brand Temple 0.4 and Temple D. Myself, Nidhi Mishra, along with my teammates Rita ma'am, Dr. Neeraj, and Mr. Mudliar, would like to would like to welcome Dr. Vivek V. Arya, DM Endocrinology from Gujarat, and Dr. Naveen Agrawal, DM Cardiology from Gujarat, for the webinar. We are thankful to Dr. Naveen and Dr. Vivek for providing us the opportunity to host the webinar. All the best to both the speakers and a warm welcome to all the attendees who are present with us today to boost the morale of the participants and witness this unique academic webinar. I'll now request Dr. Vivek Arya to initiate the session. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Special thanks to High Glance for setting up the stage. So today what I'm going to take up is a topic of male hypogonadism, which is probably less discussed topic among endocrinologists and physicians, but it is a very, very important aspect of day-to-day treatment because lot many patients are coming with varied kind of symptoms and where we are not able to diagnose or we are not able to give the appropriate treatment. Often the treatment is either inadequate or there are a good number of patients who are also over treated in such kind of situation. So let me take you in brief through the problem of male hypogonadism. So to start with, how do we classify the male hypogonadism? So basically, if it is involvement of testes, it is primary hypogonadism. If it is an involvement of hypothalamus or pituitary gland, we designate it as secondary hypogonadism. There can be problem of target tissue for testosterone, DHT, and estradiol, and this target deficiency could be either androgen insensitivity or androgen resistance. And the problem would be at the level of androgen receptor or 5-alpha reductase deficiency or aromatase deficiency. So how all this thing differs in a physiological nature. So what is basically the major chunk of pathophysiology we look for? So in a normal person who do not have hypogonadism, you have a normal hypothalamus and normal pituitary, and it has been hypothalamus has been secreting GnRH, and this GnRH acts on the level of pituitary and make pituitary produce LH and FSH. This LH and FSH, which is produced by pituitary, acts at the level of testes, and that leads to normal testosterone production and a normal hypothalamo-pituitary testicular function, which is typically been seen in such kind of situation. So this is in a person who do not have hypogonadism. Now look at what happens in primary hypogonadism. In primary hypogonadism, the target tissue damage, as I said, is testes. So there's a production of GnRH normal from the hypothalamus. It stimulates pituitary to produce LH-FSH, but because of the testicular failure, body is not able to produce enough amount of testosterone. So there is a negative feedback mechanism what goes to pituitary, and pituitary produces more LH and FSH. So there is a high LH-FSH level and a low testosterone level. That is what is typically seen in primary hypogonadism. Now let's talk about secondary hypogonadism, where there is either damage to either hypothalamus or pituitary. So there is a low production of LH and FSH. So there is a low LH FSH which is there, and because of low stimulation of LH FSH to the testicular tissue, there is low testosterone production, and hypothalamo pituitary failure with decreased gonadotropin secretion, which is typically seen. So what do you find classically? Low or normal LH-FSH and low testosterone. Then we consider secondary hypogonadism in such kind of patient. Also, there can be a mixed kind of a problem, that is an adult onset functional typically, which is seen where there is some problem at the level of hypothalamic pituitary. Also there is a combined testicular hypothalamic pituitary failure leading to variable hypogonadotropic secretion, which is typically being seen. Also, in some of the cases where we find subclinical or compensated, where the FSH may be normal and LH may be high along with normal testosterone. So this is again a compensated or a subclinical stage, which is typically being seen in such kind of situation. So what could be the underlying cause? Once we see that there is a hypogonadism, and the next important step is to find out what is a possible or the underlying cause. So once we define the person is hypogonad, where the testosterone is low, then we look either it is a primary, secondary, functional hypogonadism, or target organ resistance. So if it is a primary, it is typically a testicular cause. Testicular cause could be either mal-descended or ectopic testis, Klinefelter syndrome, testicular tumor, orchitis, congenital or acquired anarchia, or testicular atrophy or dysgenesis. When we talk about secondary, it may be either hypothalamic cause or hypophyseal cause. So hypothalamic cause could be either idiopathic, that is typically seen in Kalman syndrome, secondary GnRH deficiency, Prader-Willi syndrome. Hypophyseal or pituitary cause could be hypopituitarism. It may be either isolated or panhypopituitarism, pituitary tumor, hyperprolactinemia. There can be target organ resistance, typically feminization due to androgen resistance, 5-alpha reductase deficiency, estrogen deficit due to aromatase deficiency, which may typically be seen. So how does this kind of a classical symptom, when you see in a patient and you will think, yes, I am dealing with something what is a hypogonadism. The classical signs and symptoms include reduced testicular volume. If the person says by himself or on examination, you find that size of testis is small. Male factor infertility, a subfertility or infertility, and when the factor is typically male factor, either it is oligospermia or azoospermia. Decreased body hair. So typical history, what we ask to a patient is how frequently do you shave? If the patient says that I used to shave on a daily basis, but now hardly I shave twice in a week or once in a week, it should click in your mind that you are dealing with hypogonadism. Decreased body hair. Typically a male pattern kind of a hair, what is we are looking in a patient. If the hair growth or a person has a very few body hair, typically it is not a male pattern kind of a hair growth, you may still consider it maybe hypogonadism. Gynecomastia, loss of vigor, decreased body mass and muscle strength. Typically, they say like used to go to gym or used to use particular kind of a weight, used to do heavy work. Now they are not able to do it. So in those conditions, again, there may be a problem like that. Obesity, that is sudden increase in the weight, it may be another problem. Metabolic syndrome, that is again one of the important issue. Insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, this is again something which we may consider. Decreased bone mineral density or osteoporosis with low trauma fracture, mild anemia. There may be sexual symptoms like reduced libido, erectile dysfunction, fewer or diminished nocturnal erection, cognitive or psychovegetative symptoms or sign like hot flushes, mood changes, sleep disturbances, depression, or diminished cognitive function. Out of which some of the symptoms typically like loss of vigor, obesity, insulin resistance and type 2, decreased libido, erectile dysfunction, mood changes, probably suggest that are some of the most common signs symptoms of androgen deficiency in aging male. So that is again like we will discuss later in detail about that problem. So this may be some of the very typical symptoms of. Now, second important thing is that at what age the androgen deficiency or hypogonadism is occurring, and what is the severity and how it is going to present. It is very, very important. So if the deficiency is in utero, the absence of androgen or androgen deficiency during sexual differentiation, that is between 9th and 14th week of pregnancy, that will lead to intersexuality with incomplete or no masculization of external genitalia. So quite early, if there is androgen deficiency, it will be like ambiguous genitalia in the patient. Lack of insufficient testosterone exposure later, that is about 24th week of pregnancy, will lead to malpositioning of testes and small penis. So typically undescended kind of testes or mal-descended testes and micropenis will be the issue. If the androgen deficiency is occurring during puberty, then if it is a prepubertal kind of a hypogonadism, they will have delayed puberty, small testes, cryptorchidism, gynecomastia, high-pitched voice, unclosed epiphysis, linear growth into adulthood, so they will be ideally very tall, unicoid habitus, so the upper segment and the lower segment, so the lower segment will be much larger than the upper segment, sparse body or facial hair, infertility, low bone mass, sarcopenia, and reduced sexual activity. Now, what happens if this androgen deficiency occurs in the adulthood? They may not have those pubertal signs like, uh, but body proportion, penis size, voice that will not change. So the pitch of the voice, once it has changed, it will remain changed. The penile signs, which is whatever has been during the adulthood, will not reduce in the size. However, they may complain of body hair and the facial hair, which may reduce to certain extent. But important sign would be decreased sexual potency, loss of libido, and infertility. Just excuse me for 1 minute. There's an important call. I'll just mute for a while. Yeah, sorry for the disturbance. There was some urgent call. Okay. So this is a classical thing. What happens in uh, isolated or idiopathic hypogonadotropic hypogonadism and Kalman's syndrome. So if you look at the picture, this is a typical phenotype of Kalman syndrome. You find that long limbedness, upper segment, lower segment ratio are disturbed. All right, you find that patient has a typical features of hypogonadism. And on investigation, you will find that there is insufficient secretion of GnRH from hypothalamus. So the LHFSH are low and the testosterone is low. In Kalman syndrome, there's a genetic disorder, 1 in 10,000 male. They also have a problem of anosmia, so they will not be able to smell coffee or perfume typically when we examine the patient. And they may also have the midline defect, which may include something like impaired hearing or cleft palate. So when we talk about the hypophyseal defect, there can be the hypopituitarism, which may be hypophyseal insufficiency. And in most of the cases, it may be tumor or metastasis in the hypophysis, hyperprolactinemia. There may be because of trauma, infection, and hemochromatosis. Hyperprolactinemia because it prolactin levels which are pretty high, which can be pathological levels, and that will lead to suppression of hypothalamic GnRH secretion, leading to hypogonadism. There's a microprolactinemia itself can lead to a pressure effect, and again, it can be one of the reason producing that. When you talk about the condition of testicular dysfunction, it may be congenital, male pseudohermaphroditism, mal-descended testes, orchitis, Klinefelter syndrome, 2X male syndrome, or a testicular kind of a tumor. So it may be varied kind of a situation. So often in such kind of patients, we often go for testing like karyotype to find out if there is any other problem like 2X male syndrome or a Klinefelter syndrome, or it may be a male pseudohermaphroditism. So those kind of things may require further testing. This is what a typical Klinefelter will look like. Again, it may be the long limbedness. Typically, what we find is bilateral gynecomastia. Testes are usually small and they are firm in nature. Often in the early childhood, it is unnoticeable, and the symptoms are more often seen after the puberty. And typically, prepubertal boys, they are referred for testicular maldescent or long limbedness. Hypogonadism can be caused by disorder in which testicular dysfunction, or there can be the problem of testosterone, antimullerian hormone, or DHT, and the affected target organ is there, and that is typically in androgen insensitivity, 5-alpha reductase, or estrogen deficiency. There are certain secondary causes of hypogonadism. This is very, very important, and I'd like to emphasize over there because the obesity is most common cause and the predictor of middle-aged and the older men. There can be other problems like critical illness, type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, GI disease, epilepsy, hemochromatosis, cancer, hypertension, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, COPD, liver cirrhosis, sickle cell disease, leprosy, HIV, AIDS infection, and there can be some exogenous, like there can be a drug, a glucocorticoid therapy, irradiation, environmental toxin, and the heat. So there can be all this kind of a problem could be there, and that may be one of the important thing which may be responsible for others. Now, if there is a problem of male hypogonadism, which is typically occurring in adult, so low androgen will lead to multiple factors, and it may lead to metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, inflammation, hypertension, diabetes, vascular stiffness, and ultimately it can lead to increased risk of atherosclerosis and mortality. So androgen deficiency in adult itself has become an important topic of discussion, where it is very, very important that we take care of such kind of cases and we try to maintain or treat such kind of a patient. And uh, so the terminology of androgen deficiency in aging males or ADAMS, which has become very, very prominent. It is consistent with low testosterone associated with signs and symptoms. So it's not like we check for all subjects for low testosterone, but again, it is very, very important that we look for low testosterone in male seeking care for those kind of a problem. And there is no trial for efficacy and cost effectiveness and mortality impact of untreated low testosterone. Again, it is unknown. So whether to treat it or not to treat, again, it is very, very controversial. So first of all, who needs to be screened for androgen deficiency in adult male? So men who seeks based on symptoms. Case finding with high prevalence and a clinical disorder again becomes very, very important. So there is a questionnaire which has been developed, and again very, very important that if there is these questions have been asked to the patient: do you have decreased libido or sexual drive? Do you have decreased strength or endurance? Do you have loss of height? Have you noticed decreased enjoyment of life? Do you feel sad or grumpy? Are your erection less strong? Have you noticed recent deterioration in ability to play sport? Are you falling asleep after dinner? Has there been a recent deterioration in your work or performance? And if you answered yes for question number 1 or 7, or any 3 other questions, then probably you have low testosterone wrong. So again, very, very important to understand over here that number 1 question is lack of libido, and number 7 is your erections are less strong, probably suggests that there is androgen deficiency in adult male, or some of the other 3 questions suggest that. So again, as we discussed, the symptom of lack of sexual desire or activity is one of the important things. The less specific symptoms may be multiple, like feeling sad, poor concentration, mild anemia, sleep disturbance, increased body fat. So those may be the issues. The condition with the low testosterone screening suggests that we should also look for other causes like cellular mass, if the radiation has been given, glucocorticoid, ketoconazole, opioid abuse, HIV associated weight loss, ESRD, COPD. So all these are very, very important factors which we may look. Relevant medical history becomes very, very important about the pubertal development, sexual development, major illnesses, all prescription and non-prescription drug, relation problem, sexual problem, major life events, related family history, recent changes in body, the typical development of breast or testicular problem becomes very, very important. On examination, typically you look for body hair, enlargement or tenderness in the breast, size and the testis, size of penis, signs of severe or prolonged androgen deficiency, that is loss of body hair, reduced muscle bulk or strength, osteoporosis, or small testicle. So we have this thing like this is called as orchidometer, where we have you can compare the size of testes with this and find out what is the testicular volume. So in an adult, the volume is around 20 to 25 is considered to be good. A volume of more than 4 suggests early puberty, more than 8 suggests mid puberty, and more than 12 suggests late puberty, and 20 to 25 suggests. What is the guideline for screening? Initial screening, morning testosterone to be taken, confirmed on another occasion. If required, you also check for free or bioavailable testosterone. Do not screen during acute or subacute illness where it is going to be low, definitely like malnutrition, illness, or certain medication. So typically you wait for a few weeks before you do such kind of test. What is the treatment algorithm, diagnosis algorithm? So presence of one or more component of metabolic syndrome, or if there's a clinical signs, symptoms of testosterone deficiency, or there is erectile dysfunction. You check total testosterone. If it is less than 8 or less than 250 nanogram per dl, consider one of the following tests depending on the clinical situation. Either you check for gonadotropin or free testosterone, prolactin, estradiol, thyroid, adrenal excess, stimulation of pituitary gland, karyotype, fertility status, testicular ultrasound, MRI of pituitary and hypothalamus. If the testosterone is between 8 to 12 nanomole or between 250 to 230, proceed with trial of testosterone therapy after exclusion of contraindication. If it is more than 12, that is more than 350 nanogram, assess free testosterone. If it is free testosterone is less than 8 nanogram per dl or more less than 270 picomole per liter, then in such case, again, we may consider trial of testosterone therapy. Following that, every 3 to 6 months, we'll look for the efficacy, we'll check for the hematocrit, PSA, and if required for erectile dysfunction, patient may consider to be adding phosphodiesterase inhibitor 5 and such kind of patients. There can be sometimes problem with the sex hormone binding globulin. It is very, very important, like obesity, which lowers sex hormone binding globulin, nephrotic syndrome, hypothyroidism, glucocorticoid, progestin, androgen, steroid, which lowers the sex hormone binding globulin, and the aging, hepatic cirrhosis, hyperthyroidism, anticonvulsant, estrogen, HIV, which increases the sex hormone binding globulin. Let us take a few of the cases like which may come across in our clinical practice. So just will give us an further insight like how do you proceed in such kind of a patient. A 52-year-old male who has hypertension treated with Viagra for 2 years for loss of libido. Blood pressure is 150 by 99, so it is high. Mild gynecomastia, no testosterone, LHFSH are low, prolactin is high. What is the best next step? So probably in such patient, goes to a person who's not aware, like in this kind of a patient, he may prescribe Viagra and send the patient back home. Somebody may just prescribe testosterone and just send home. If you look back in the case, like typically low testo, low LHFSH and prolactin is very high, which suggests that patient has hyperprolactinemia, so there is a problem of pituitary. probably the right answer in this patient would be to do MRI. And the MRI was done in this patient, and you find that patient has a pituitary tumor here. This is a prolactinoma, typically you see over here. When should you get a pituitary MRI? Severe hypogonadism, testosterone less than 150, symptoms of tumor mass, headache, visual impairment, visual defect, persistent hyperprolactinemia, panhypopituitarism. So in this kind of patient, a pituitary MRI is a must. Often patient will come, a male patient, showing that his bone density is low. Should you get a DEXA? DEXA is recommended in men with severe androgen deficiency or if they have a history of low trauma fracture. Cost effectiveness is unknown. The goal of testosterone therapy to improve and maintain secondary sexual characteristic, improve libido and erection, increase energy and well-being, improve muscle mass, and improve bone mineral density. Who should be treated? Men with low testosterone and signs of androgen deficiency, men with low testosterone and low libido, men with low testosterone and erectile dysfunction. So they should be treated. Who else should be treated? People with low testosterone, HIV infection, and weight loss. And men with low testosterone taking high glucocorticoid, they should also be treated. What about older men? They should be treated if clinical symptoms are there. And depending on the severity, the level of testosterone they have, some say testosterone less than 200, some say testosterone less than 300. So again, it is a debatable issue. Let's go to the another case. This is a 75-year-old male, lower thoracic vertebral fracture after falling from wet floor, non-smoker, poor energy, libido and erection, not what used to be. Testosterone is 2 times low as compared to the normal range. LHFSH are normal, anemic, normal calcium phosphate. DEXA shows patient has osteoporosis. What is the best course of treatment? The patient definitely has osteoporosis. Patient is hypogonadal. So what would be the best option? Would be nasal calcitonin, bisphosphonate, testosterone replacement, calcium and vitamin D, testosterone and bisphosphonate. So probably in this patient, you will consider testosterone replacement along with anti-osteoporotic agent because patient also have a senile osteoporosis along with hypogonadism. Who should not receive testosterone therapy, which is very, very important. Who of these gentlemen do not require testosterone therapy? Very, very important. We have to understand the contraindication. Contraindications are breast or prostate cancer, lump or hardness in the prostate on digital rectal examination, PSA more than 3, severe untreated BPH, erythrocytosis, hematocrit more than 50%, hyperviscosity, untreated obstructive apnea, severe heart failure, class 3 or class 4. Testosterone may be harmful in certain like cases where people have been using for improvement or for athletic performance, for physical appearance or prevent aging. So there it is actually harmful. How do you give testosterone? Standard dose should be prescribed in the beginning after checking the level. A therapeutic target should be considered. Target for older, which may depend on the expert, like typically we may keep something between 400 to 500 gram. But what are the modes? It may be a transdermal patch, which mimics normal diurnal variation rhythm. Less increase in hemoglobin than IM shots. Start with 1 to 2, 5 milligram nightly, which has been put on the thighs or on the upper arm. Always apply from pressure away from the pressure area, and some men need 2 patches. Skin irritation, redness, and rash are the common problem. Other option is gels. You can start with 5 to 10 gram daily. The skin tolerates well. Possibly potential transfer to other by skin contact, which is always there. So you should wash your hand. And other option is to give injection, that is testosterone enanthet or cyconate injection, IM. And testosterone level are supraphysiologic, then gradually drops to a hypogonadal range. So the peak and tough, which is typically been seen. So there is a fluctuation in mood and libido, which is typically seen. Start with 75 to 100 milligram weekly or 150 to 200 milligram given every alternate week. Pain at injection site and excessive erythrocytosis may be the common problem. These are buccal bioadhesive tablets which are also available. So 30 milligram buccal mucosa twice, which can be again used in some of the patient. Problems are gum irritation, and there are testosterone pellets. So you have this kind of pellet inserter. With this, a pellet could be inserted. A 200 milligram pellet could be inserted in subcu. The serum level reaches peak at 1 month and it is maintained for 4 to 6 months. So that is requires a minor surgical process which could be used in such kind of patient. So how do we monitor? Target is target in the mid range. Timing midway between the injection. Target is between 350 to 700 nanogram per deciliter and adjust according to the patches 3 to 12 hours after the application, gel after 1 to 2 weeks after the treatment. So what is the safety monitoring? We check for digital rectal examination, PSA, hematocrit, follow up every 3 months and then annually. If osteoporosis, DEXA every 1 to 2 years. The PSA level, if it is high, they should consult urologist. When to consult urologist? Average increase in PSA after starting testo, that is 0.3 nanogram per ml in a young or 0.44 in older, or increase of 1.4 in any 3 months usual period, then they require a urologist. 1.4 nanogram per year, then they should consult urologist. More than 4, consult urologist. So look at the velocity of PSA. Based on that, or there is abnormal digital rectal examination, they should consult urologist. Hematocrit more than 54, stop testosterone, evaluate for hypoxia and OSA. Smoking cessation and phlebotomy may be required in those kind of patients. So to conclude my talk, the screening of asymptomatic patient and high-risk population is must. Evaluate for underlying cause for primary or secondary. Treat symptomatic patient with equivocal low testosterone level. The option could be either shots, patches, pills, buccal, so depending on the patient preference, and monitor for adverse event. With this, I thank you a lot for patience. Thank you so much.
Should I start my lecture? I will start my lecture. Good afternoon, everybody. The topic for my discussion is on chronic stable angina. I hope I'm audible. Several years ago, Heberdean had described angina as a sense of strangling and anxiety. Usually, anginal pain is less often described as pain. It is more often discomfort and anxiety. This is more pertinent to have in anginal pain rather than just a patient comes to you with a sort of chest pain. Typically, the pain is poorly localized chest or arm discomfort. Usually, it can be described as swelling, heaviness, burning in chest, which may or may not be described as pain. A lot of people who come to us do burning in chest with the financial acid peptic disease and tend to start visiting for dyspepsia, which causes inadvertent delay in obtaining treatment or care for cardiac problems and usually might lead to disastrous consequences for the patient as well. Whenever a patient comes to you with heaviness, especially when it is on exertion, if there is heaviness in the chest, that should be considered as a manifestation of angina and should be taken care of and should be evaluated in detail. The pain could range anywhere from the neck to the umbilicus. Isolated Neck, arm और jaw pain is a very common. Very common patients come to us कि साहब राइट में पेन हो रहा है, हार्ट का कैसे हो सकता है, ये पीछे पेन हो रहा है, ये हार्ट का कैसे हो सकता है, हार्ट तो लेफ्ट में होता है. This is a very common misconception. The cardiac pain can range anywhere from the neck to the umbilicus. It can happen anywhere in both shoulders, and it can isolatedly be only over the right shoulder as well. So if at all you have a patient who comes to you with a chest pain which is atypical and not at the conventional side, then also you cannot completely rule out of the pain. You have to take other consideration as well. Shortness of breath, fainting, unexplained fatigue are considered as anginal equivalents. Sometimes the patient might come to you with shortness of breath or sudden unexplained syncope or sudden unexplained fatigue. In such patients, you don't find any change, and these can be considered as angina equivalents. The pain should be reproducibly precipitated by physical exertion or emotional stress. Whenever the patient walks, there should be similar chest pain. It should be not like the pain sometimes is occurring on walking 5 kilometers, sometimes on walking 200 meters. So the pain should be reproducible on performing the same amount of exertion on every time. And it should be relieved by rest within 5 to 15 minutes by rest or sublingual nitrate. It should not be like as soon as I take sorbitol, within 2 seconds the pain stops. It should be, it should not be like that also, that I took sorbitol and took 2 hours and then the pain stopped. There is a time limit also to the response to nitroglycerin tablets. Response to nitroglycerin can be used as a diagnostic whenever you are not sure whether the pain is angina or non-angina. Do not try to diagnose or refute the diagnosis of angina clinically alone. Several times we've had several patients who have made a mistaken diagnosis of non-cardiac chest pain just by the character of the pain, and eventually the patient ends up in a myocardial infarction and might also succumb. It is also impossible to make a clinically 100% sure clinical diagnosis of chest pain. Slightly always better to over-investigate than to under-investigate, because doesn't harm a patient whenever you are doing a treadmill test or an echocardiography to evaluate the patient. If you miss the diagnosis and the patient ends up with a myocardial infarction, then it becomes a problem and the patient might lose his life or have a lot of comorbid, might have a lot of morbidity as well. Even if the patient doesn't die also. So it's always to over-investigate, and it's also important medico-legally also, because no one will sue you for not doing an extra treadmill or an extra troponin test, but if at all you miss the diagnosis and the patient dies, then you can have medico-legal case issues as well. Let's have documentation of all the investigation of on paper. So often it happens that the patient comes to you and you do not document everything on paper. You just tell the patient to do this and that. And if at all such a case lands in the court of law, then you have nothing written on the prescription paper. And something which is very important medico-legally is that you should know that anything which is not mentioned on the paper or the prescription paper or documented is considered to be not done. So verbal dictation, unless it is a recorded verbal discussion, doesn't have any value in the court of law. So medico-legally also you can have more safety if you document everything on a piece of paper. Do not be in a hurry to diagnose or refute acid disease diagnosis, because sometimes you just diagnose aseptic disease and send the patient back, and the patient comes back with a myocardial infarction. Angina can have really unusual presentations. So often you can have patients who have exertional symptoms, even exertional headaches also. So whenever a patient has any exertional symptom, always take care to rule out coronary artery disease. There is no harm in slightly over-investigating the patient and under-investigating them. When it is unlikely to be angina, the pain is realized at one point, side the patient points a finger towards his chest, which is known as the Levine finger pointing sign. When it's a pricking type of pain, to right type of pain, pain lasts for several hours or lasting for a few seconds, and pain reduced by palpation of arm or neck movement. There is likelihood of anginal evolution. Now, what is chronic stable angina? Chronic stable angina is patient having a pattern of angina which is stable for more than 3 months. It can be because of coronary arteries, because of myocardial bulging, arthritis, or radiation. The chest pain can be aortic stenosis and cardiomyopathy patients and other cardiac overload conditions. Risk factors like dyslipidemia, hypertension, cigarette smoking, sedentary lifestyle, and diabetes can be suggestive of cardiac origin of chest pain. And whenever these are present, especially when diabetes is present, you should always consider the possibility of ischemic heart disease. Whenever you have a patient of chest pain, always better to get a resting ECG done, because that will help you in diagnosing or refuting the diagnosis. But a resting ECG will not always confirm the diagnosis. Sometimes in chronic stable angina patient, it might be a normal ECG as well. Even in acute function, 10% of the times, it might be completely normal. So a normal ECG or a normal echo completely does not rule out the presence or absence of angina in diagnosis and prognostication. But it is always better to at least do a stress test. If a stress test is negative, you are at least 80% sure there is no ischemic heart disease. If it is positive, it is 80% sure, 70 to 80% sure that it is an ischemic heart disease, and you need to further evaluate the patient. Treatment, you have to focus on pharmacological therapy. You have to treat the risk factors. You have to adjust you have to revascularize the patient, and you have to prognosticate the patient. Suppose you have having factors which are worsening the angina, like anemia, weight loss, weight gain, thyroid disease, fever, infections, tachycardia, and cocaine abuse. These are the factors which can worsen angina. And so whenever you have a patient with the worsening of angina because of these factors, these points should also be addressed. CAD-related factors like diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, smoking should be addressed appropriately. A lot of studies have shown that almost 94% of risk factors can be attributed to few causes like cholesterol, tobacco, depression, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. And protective factors can have a negative attributable risk like physical activity, high fruits and vegetable diet, and moderation of alcohol. These have a negative predictive value for causation of coronary artery disease. All patients should be encouraged to exercise and do yoga and meditation. Gives the patient mental as well as physical stress relief and reduce the incidence of coronary artery disease. Revascularization in chronic stable angina is a controversial issue. Usually till date, for risk patients and patients having borderline disease with chronic stable angina, revascularization and angioplasty has not been shown to be very beneficial. It doesn't provide a mortality benefit. So every patient having a disease need not always be sent for an angioplasty. You have to evaluate the patient, and if at all the patient is having unstable angina, then for intervention is required. But whenever the angina is stable, usually angioplasty does give a simple improvement to the patient, but mortality benefit is not there even in medically managed patients. So medically managed patients can do equally well giving them appropriate therapy. If at all you have a patient with CCS class 1 or 2 angina, you can manage them medically. But if at all is not responding to medical management, the patient is having a disease at a very high risk, like a proximal left main, where infarction might be fatal for the patient. In such cases, you need to revascularize the patient. Angioplasty bypass is a big issue, big controversial issue. Earlier, the trend was favoring bypass for almost all cases, but recently, with the advent of good quality lens and the confidence of the cardiologist in performing a multi-vessel PCI and complex procedures as well, and with the advent of imaging to help in revascularization, we have found that a lot of patients and a lot more doctors are preferring for most of comparison to CABG. And it is comfort for the patient because normal lifestyle of the patient gets restored in the next few days of doing an angioplasty in comparison to a bypass surgery, and there are no surgical scars. Some things which need to be explained to the patient is that recurrence can occur after a CABG as well, because a lot of patients tend to think that body surgery to usually it is like if at all the patient is also going a CABG in comparison to an angioplasty, there is still a chance of recurrence. Although the option of treatment after recurrence are lesser with CABG as compared to an angioplasty. Tissue perfusion might be compromised in the CABG patient, irrespective of the graft functioning also, because sometimes what happens that the native vessel disease progresses, there is no blood flow to native vessel, although the graft is functioning, but the patient receives inadequate blood supply and does continue to have vaginal pain as well. Whenever you are sending a patient for CABG, you always demand for a complete revascularization and arterial revascularization, because venous grafts tend to last shorter and might get occluded very easily. Stent thrombosis complications with angioplasty can be managed much more easily as compared to severe complications with CABG. CBG cannot usually be done as an emergency procedure of patient comes to us and has a multivessel disease. We maybe a subsequent CBG at a later date, but the patient fails to understand such issues. So one should always tell to the patient and make the patient understand that CBG is not an emergency procedure and cannot be done on an emergency. If at all, if it is done on an emergency basis, the risk is very much. Patients with diffuse and multivessel disease, there is diffusion is also and risk of glass fluorosis is very high in diffuse. Such patients, when we do a CBG also, the patients may not do so well in the long term. MR often for a CBG regresses after an anesthesia as well. And one or two patients in my career, I have seen that the MR is so severe that you compulsory in the patient. Most of them you do get good after anesthesia, and most of the MRs also do regress, especially with good medical management. Multivessel PCI is amenable wherever you have a lesion is amenable to angioplasty. Sometimes the patients have diffuse disease, multiple site disease, then of course, or left main disease, or patient cannot be technically taken for angioplasty. CBG is the preferred option. Sometimes you need to ask the patient choice. You give the patient both the option and let the patient decide if the patient versus CBG or vice versa. Then he can be advised to take the decision according to what he prefers to be the better option. Although both options and both options should be explained to each and every. Usually 20-25% patients do have anginal pain even after an angioplasty, and such patients need to add medications. Sometimes it happens because of suboptimal or inadequate revascularization of all the vessels. In comparison, CBG patients have incidence of repeat anginal pain are much lesser with post CBG patients as compared to bypass patients. The pharmacology, the goals are the reduction of ischemic events, reduce mortality, and reversing the disease process. For chronic angina, includes beta blockers, the vasoprotective agents include aspirin and statins. All these drugs should be a part of our for the management of all such patients. Beta blocker should be the cornerstone of therapy for all these patients, and so when we find the patient on 3 and 4 anti-angiogenics, beta blocker is often missing as a part of the prescription. Ideally, the heart rate should be stable at around 50 to 60 beats per minute, and with modest exercise, the resting heart rate should not increase more than 20 beats per minute. This is what is defined as beta blocker. Anything lesser than that or any heart rate more than that is maybe characterized as a suboptimal beta blocker. Nitrates really should be given for inadequate control of angina despite revascularization as well, or in patients not amenable for revascularization. But nitrates should not be given as a split dose because of tachyphylaxis issues, and a lot of patients do develop side effects like headache and hypotension. So better to prefer the newer anti-anginals like xanilozine and trimetazidine for such patients. Patients having recurrent angina despite medical management usually should be for revascularization if it has not been done already. Ivabradine can be used as an add-on therapy for anginal pain whenever the patient is adequately having a good heart rate control with beta blockers. Beta blockers can help in ischemia management as well as in Ivabradine can only help in ischemia management, only reduce the heart rate of the patient. It cannot help in arrhythmia management, and any patient in sinus rhythm who has had inappropriate sinus tachycardia can be given Ivabradine as an adjunct to beta blocker, but it should not ideally be preferred over beta blocker. Beta blocker can also be given. Metabolic modulators like trimetazine and nicorandil and trimetazine and ranitidine can help in modifying the glucose metabolism of the patient and help in reducing some amount of heart failure. These drugs have some amount of safety and be preferred over conventional anti-anginals. Last few slides, I'll be discussing the role of non-conventional therapies like ECP and chelation therapy. Usually, these therapies are not US FDA approved, as contrary to what is these people market. These therapies are recommended only as an add-on therapy, as a palliative therapy in case who are not amenable for revascularization in such patients. As a direct therapy for a patient who, where angioplasty is possible or a bypass is possible, usually this is not recommended as a first-line therapy. The benefits of ECP are it increases the oxygen supply and decreases the chest pain, but the effect is only short-term and maximum 1 or 2 years. Ideally, in patients where angioplasty is possible, or patients where atrial fibrillation is there, a pacemaker is there, peripheral arterial disease is there, severely elevated blood pressure is there, or heart rate more than 120 beats per minute is there. In such cases, ECP should not be done for such patients. Patients having structural heart disease also should not be taken for an ECP. Chelation therapy again is a doubtful issue. Usually it is not recommended in any foreign countries and all. It is not practiced in India. A lot of people do perform it. Till then, there is no documented evidence of success of ECP in any given case, and ECP and chelation therapy actually should not be used and offered to your patients. There are some Ayurvedic medications, Arjuna Chal, and I don't know what people keep taking, but usually this is Arjuna Chal is recommended for heart failure. It is not a blockage opening therapy and should not be recommended for your patients who have a coronary artery disease without a heart failure. This was a video which was viral several years ago, and people used to think that this was a vacuum aspiration catheter. We can aspirate any cholesterol blockage and was a replacement to stenting therapy. But this was a catheter only for clot aspiration or a vacuum aspiration. It is not meant for routine therapy for any patient where lesion is present. This cannot aspirate a lesion. It can only aspirate clot and open up the vessel. Now, the conclusion is that you should not try to diagnose or refute angina clinically alone. Usually, revascularization does not have a clinically significant benefit in chronic stable angina, especially except for condition where there is a life-threatening lesion. Complete revascularization should be attempted in all such cases. Medical therapy has an important role in chronic stable angina, and surgery or revascularization should be considered whenever the medical therapy is not being able to manage adequately the chronic stable angina. Newer drugs are effective in reducing angina and have a favorable safety profile. Non-pharmacological therapy do not have much role and should not be advised as an therapy or a destination therapy to your patients. Usually, you can give a monotherapy of anti-anginal or use an add-on therapy, but beta blockers should not be forgotten as an anti-anginal role as well, besides its role in heart failure and other management of arrhythmias as well. So I thank you all for the very patient listening. Angina management is a very common topic for most of the general practitioners in their day-to-day practice, and a lot of people do see chest pain patients in their day-to-day practice. So I hope that by virtue of this discussion, a few take-home points you might have grasped, and this might help you in your patient management in your day-to-day practice. Chronic stable angina, rather than discussing only about chronic stable angina, I was more trying to discuss with the regular aspects of chest pain management. So I hope that is clinically useful for you as well. Any questions regarding this topic? I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, sir. Till now, we have just 1 minute. Let me check. Thank you so much, sir. Till now, we have not received any queries. Okay, so I would like to express my gratitude to both Dr. Naveen and Dr. Vivek for their cooperation. And we are very thankful to support that you have given us HighGlance products in your practices. And we thank our management, support staff, and field force. Once again, thanks to all delegates who came came for this webinar. And good day, stay safe. Thank you, sir.